There had been a struggle. There had been horror, fear, violence. These had passed. The room was still now, with an utter stillness that reached out and laid its dead weight upon the two in the doorway. What is this about? A magazine from 100 years ago. The Ladies' Home Journal, volume 41, issue number 4, happens to be the April volume of 1924. This day, I'm going to read a story. It's kind of a thriller within the magazine. It's called The Girl Who Came at Night. Now, it's kind of long, not super long, it's still a short story, but you know how they have those in magazines where it's on one page and then another page, and then it says in little tiny letters at the bottom, continued on page 145 or something, and then you have to go find it, and then it goes on some more. What I thought I would do is read, a page or a section and then do a commercial break. We'll do a publicity break or a commercial break. And the commercial, of course, will be something that we find that's interesting in the magazine. Here it is, the Ladies' Home Journal. This one was issued to Alice E. Johnson, I think. And this is the cover of our issue. Volume 41, number 4, April 1924. In this issue, a great painting of the president. And we're talking President Coolidge. It's the Curtis Publishing Company in Pennsylvania. Anyway, the story that I want to read to us, The Girl Who Came in the Night by Louise Kennedy Mabie, illustrated by H.J. Mowat. And this picture here would be a part of this story. And I won't read this caption because it's maybe containing a spoiler, I don't know. The Girl Who Came in the Night. And look at this A. This is illuminated. A house, white pillared, with green shuttered, ample, protected from the road by a wall of rough stone, partially hidden by massed shrubberies, reached by a driveway which curved in from one entrance and out to another. Such a house was Mrs. Broderick's. Tonight in June, with the place drenched in moonlight, the rose garden in bloom, and her husband George in Kansas City, Mrs. Broderick, in her cool four-poster, in her cool, beautiful corner room, decided definitely that Nick, her head man, must not be given a free hand with the ducks. And drifting off to sleep, the thought came uppermost that, extravagant as it might be to have a butler, George had insisted upon a man underfoot and in the way about the country house, so it was up to George. Not that Tier was really a nuisance, a nice, clean-cut young chap, Tier with a good jaw, if still a little awkward with the iced tea glasses. Here Mrs. Broderick, drifting off, reached oblivion and dreamed that Lloyd George, losing his vote of confidence and wishing to advertise for its return, was pattering up the half-circle of her driveway, and beneath her window was calling, "May I use your telephone? May I use your telephone?" Mrs. Broderick turned overside and opened her eyes. The patch of moonlight on the hooked rug had moved. It must be very late. "May I use your telephone?" a voice was saying beneath her window, softly, cautiously, a girl's voice, anxious, controlled. And then, when nothing answered, "Oh, what am I to do? What am I to do?" Mrs. Broderick slipped her feet into her mauve satin heelless slippers with the pom-poms, with neatness, efficiency, and dispatch. As one hand caught up a mauve dressing gown and the other switched on a night light which illuminated a tiny clock. The light switched off as the dressing gown switched on, and Mrs. Broderick was at her window, raising the screen. A very beautiful girl in a blonde, gray-eyed, wistful way stood bareheaded, wrapped in a loose dark coat, looking up. And the white moon revealing her, producing her, seemed to Mrs. Broderick to be a vast spotlight hung up in the heavens for no other purpose. The girl glanced behind her at the massed shrubberies, at the silver curve of the drive, and then up again at Mrs. Broderick, staring down in complete and patent astonishment. "It's so very bright," the girl said anxiously. "Do you mind if I stand beside the hydrangeas until you can open the door?" Again, the quick look behind. "I thought you'd never answer," she added. "I was dreaming," said Mrs. Broderick. "But, my dear child, what is it? An accident? Automobile?" But the girl, instead of answering, mutely held up both hands, and Mrs. Broderick saw that one of them was bleeding. "My dear child," she said once more breathlessly, and slamming down the screen, swept across the hooked rug and jerked open the door. But just outside her door stood Tyr in a dressing gown, his sleek black hair rumpled, a little electric torch in his hand. Tyr with a look of suppressed excitement about him. "Just a moment, Mrs. Broderick," he said. "Have you thought that this may be a plant?" "A plant?" said Mrs. Broderick scathingly. "What kind of a plant? Conservatory? Garden?" "Common or garden," said Tyr coolly. "It's often done. A girl for decoy, a gang with a car, open doors, loot." "Stand aside, my young man," said Mrs. Broderick scornfully. "That lovely girl is no decoy. I saw her." "Well, then, but if you insist," said Tyr, "I feel it is my duty to warn you that this may be a larger order than it seems, Mrs. Broderick. That girl has been badly frightened. She's probably running away." "Stuff and nonsense, Tyr. Just another automobile accident." "Then you're going in blind for whatever it is?" asked Tyr, with almost a hint of admiration in his tone. "I'm going in with my eyes open for whatever it is," said Mrs. Broderick crisply. "Now, suppose you walk down ahead of me and open that door." And so it happened that in the little telephone room just off the wide central hall, there presently stood about a Chippendale chair a short circle of dressing gowns. Mrs. Broderick's of frilly mauve silk, Tyr's of plain camel hair wool, and Miss Floyd's, Miss Broderick's eye-glassed, slightly lame, admirable secretary and friend of years, a surprisingly gorgeous rose-embroidered crepe which Mrs. Broderick's daughter Ivy had sent her from Honolulu. "So you were driving fast without lights?" prompted Mrs. Broderick. "And there was a fallen oak tree across the road?" Here she hesitated, and the girl in the Chippendale chair shivered. Was anyone killed?" "I don't know," shuddered the girl. "I was thrown clear." "How far from here?" asked Mrs. Broderick. "I don't know," answered the girl. "I think on that lonely back road to Richfield. 4 miles, 3. I'm not good at judging distance. Running and walking, it seemed 20. "So you walked? Why didn't you use the telephone in the nearest house? I thought I could make it, but at your gate my strength gave out, and your lovely house looked kind. It beckoned." Make it to where?" "To Larson's. He's the superintendent at the Caroline place." At this point, Mrs. Broderick glanced at Tyr, silent beside her, but Tyr was looking at the girl. "Caroline's is 3 miles up this road," said Mrs. Broderick, glancing toward the doorway, through which Tyr was disappearing. "It was to Larson you wished to telephone? Do you live at Larson's?" There was a short silence before the girl answered. She was very white under the lights. Her lips were unsteady. The handkerchief, and here I just want to look. He had forgotten Larson. No, that's something for later. So let's just finish this. The handkerchief which Mrs. Broderick had bound about her injured hand was turning red. "Hilda Larson, the wife, is a friend. I sometimes stay," she jerked out at length. Then, with a gesture of pushing something away, "Oh, please, don't ask me anything more. I can't. The poor dog, I'm afraid I'm going to faint." "Drink this," said Tyr briefly, appearing with a tiny glass in his hand, "and give me that telephone number. I'm calling the Larsons for you." Incredibly swift, unusually deft, Tyr with his small glass. Mrs. Broderick found time to reflect while he was trying to get central. And very oddly dressed, this girl. A man's coat, a shabby jersey dress. The finest clocked silk stockings, and here Mrs. Broderick frankly stared. Low-heeled evening sandals of silver brocade. The sandals were dusty and stained with grass, but beneath the dust and the green streaks of Mrs. Broderick saw that they were unique, custom-made, and that they had been beautiful. And Mrs. Broderick knew the one bootmaker in Paris who could have produced them. The girl was lying back with closed eyes. Miss Floyd was gently smoothing her forehead, patting her shoulder, when Tyr hung up the receiver with a grunt. "Nothing doing," said he, coming over to the girl. "They're away, or the phone is out of order. They don't answer." Opening her gray eyes, she looked up at him for a dazed moment. Then in a wild alarm, "Hilda!" she cried, and again, "Hilda!" And grasping the chair with both hands, she tried to stand, but the effort, any effort, was beyond her. She sank back limply and fainted away. As Mrs. Broderick followed the little procession up the colonial staircase, Miss Floyd limped ahead, Tyr with the girl in his arms, the toes of her silver sandals just brushing the paneling as they mounted. She found time to think of George in Kansas City and to applaud George's infallible judgment, for it was proving to be a very good thing to have a man underfoot and in the way about the country house. She was glad of Tyr's presence, of his inches, of his strength, and she was beginning to rely upon his simplicity and his common sense. As she faced him in the upper hall after the girl had been put to bed in a rosy-chintzed guest room, Mrs. Broderick, for the moment, had quite forgotten that he sometimes said, "Sure," and that he had probably never gone to Harvard. "Well," said Mrs. Broderick. Tyr just looked at Mrs. Broderick, his dark eyes bright. "May I have the roadster for an hour?" he asked. "May I come along?" asked the lady, surprised in her turn. And, surprisingly, with the manner of one giving permission, Tyr nodded. When he brought the car round the door, Mrs. Broderick was waiting. A polo coat over her dressing gown, a lace scarf over her permanent wave. "Larson's?" she asked as they got in. "Larson's first to wake up this sleepy Hilda," conceded Tyr as they roared up the road. 3 miles are nothing to a racing roadster. They started. They arrived with a scarcely perceptible interval made up of trees streaking past and a white ribbon of road winding up behind them. "The main house is a mile in," said Mrs. Broderick as they flashed along a high brick wall. "I've never seen it. It's been closed for a year or more. Very exclusive and smart, these Carolines, what there are left of them, and immensely rich, of course. I've seen Mrs. Joe, the daughter-in-law, in the Sunday supplements." "So have I," said Tyr, "riding an elephant at Southampton on a bet, diamond anklets, the hard-boiled type. They say the old man pays her an allowance to keep away. They don't seem to shake down according to the papers. And the old man's gone a bit queer since Joe Caroline's plane was shot down in the water. You see, Joe was his only son. Poor old man, lonely, bereft, nothing but money. Hadn't the Joe Carolines children?" asked Mrs. Broderick. "I believe there was a kid somewhere in the background," said Tyr. "Hullo, the gates are open. We're out of luck, Mrs. Broderick. We're driving in, but we won't find Larson. Larson went off chop in a bit of a hurry, and Larson has not yet returned." "How can you know?" "The gates. They've never been opened before, but we'll knock up his house just in case." They were following a straight white road beneath the arching elms. The moon hung low. There was a smell of early summer dawn in the air. A turn to the left brought them past a thicket of white birches to the cottage, timbered and plastered in the style of old England. "Larson's," said Tyr, and brought the car to a standstill. It seems to Mrs. Broderick that she sat in the car for a long time while Tyr rang, while Tyr knocked, while Tyr circled the silent cottage and came back to stand looking up at it grimly, one hand on the car door. "But look here," said Mrs. Broderick suddenly. "They've been from home for some time. There isn't a window open. Every shade is drawn tight, and it's a hot night in June. So, who is sponsoring our reading for today? Well, at the time, it was, and we can pretend it's now, Gold Seal Congoleum Art Rugs. Here's the art rug, so to speak. And here is Jack and a lady. "You're a wonder, Jack, to get such a beautiful rug for so little money." And it's true. He did get this rug, and it looks like it would be beautiful, especially if we were able to see it in color, but not today. So, wow, you can get a 9-foot by 10.5-foot rug, art rug, for $15.75, or 9 feet by 12 feet for $18. Tyr, turning swiftly toward Mrs. Broderick, raised 2 fingers to his forehead in a little gesture of salute, and Mrs. Broderick, in spite of herself, felt gratified. "I want to look at the main house," said Tyr as he started the car. "Now that we're in, we may not get in again, and of course the gang would scatter after the crash." So this picture says he had forgotten Larson. He had forgotten what might be waiting in the room above. She was safe. She was near. Wonder what that's about. "The gang?" echoed Mrs. Broderick. "Why, yes, we spoke of a gang back there at home, didn't we, before I opened the door?" "You warned me that the girl might be a forerunner of horrors," said Mrs. Broderick, "that people in masks might come bursting in. Well, they didn't." "No," said Tyr conclusively. "It isn't going to be as childish as that." Now, Mrs. Broderick had never encountered a gang, and it is not to be wondered that she edged a bit closer to Tyr and glanced backward once or twice over her shoulder as they ran the car, which had roared like a beast of prey, now reduced to the even gentle purring of a family cat asleep in its basket. And then all sound suddenly ceased as Tyr stopped the car and shut off his engine. For below them lay silence, beauty, formal gardens, a sunken pool, tennis courts, smooth green lawns, clipped yew trees in rows, and the chill, vast white pile of an Italian palace. "Some joint," was Tyr's comment. "A house," said Mrs. Broderick impressively, didactically, "not a home." The place seemed to reach up and grip them with an icy, intangible fascination. Mystery lay over it. Potential tragedy seemed to hover above it. Washed by the fading moonlight, it looked like a fairy palace ringed by an evil spell. "Closed and boarded up for a year," said Tyr. "There would have to be a caretaker, of course." "I fancy not in the house itself," said Mrs. Broderick, "if this Larson person is in charge nearby." "There's something there now," said Tyr simply, "for I see a light. Follow that stone balustrade, then go up 1 story, go up 2, stop at the 3rd window from the chimney. Do you see it? Just a thin line of light below a drawn shade, just a sliver, a gleam. The 3rd window?" "Why, of course," said Mrs. Broderick breathlessly, eagerly. "I see it, Tyr, clearly." "Somebody's in there, all right," said Tyr, "but I don't think it's Hilda. Somebody who isn't advertising the fact." "I'd like to look in that window, Mrs. Broderick. I'd give a good deal—" He stopped, considering. "I could make it if there was a coping, but darn these Italian houses. They're as flat as your hand. There isn't purchase for a squirrel on the whole blamed facade." Mrs. Broderick glanced at him curiously. "What about driving up to the front door like Christians?" she suggested, "ringing the bell and asking for Larson." "Fatal," said Tyr. "If anyone answered, don't you see how it would give her away?" "Give her away? To whom?" "To Larson." "But she was trying to reach Larson." "She was trying to reach his wife," said Tyr. Mrs. Broderick sat back and drew a deep breath. "You don't by any chance think it may have been from Larson that she was running away?" "I don't think it was," said Tyr briefly. "I know it was." Mrs. Broderick, tingling, felt that beside Tyr's acuteness, her own had stumbled and been brought up at a round turn. She had fallen short of his expectation, and she realized with a little sensation of surprise that she wished to stand well with Tyr. He reminded her a little of her son-in-law, Amby Symes. Amby was a millionaire, and his family tree had sprouted under William the Conqueror. Amby had gone to Harvard and knew Ronsard in the original, but he frequently said, "Sure," and he never had been acutely intelligent in his life. "The back road to Richfield," Tyr was saying. "There may be a shorter way out through the Caroline woods, but we'd better go the way they did, through the gates." "If there is a shorter way out," asked Mrs. Broderick, "and this Larson was in great haste, as you say he was, why didn't he take it?" "Shorter from here, not from the cottage? I figured that they started from the cottage." "They? Do you mean Larson and the gang, if there was a gang, or Larson and the girl?" "Well, look here," said Tyr grimly. "Figure that when he started, he had her with him." Even in her anxiety to follow attentively, Mrs. Broderick noted the way in which Tyr stressed and almost capitalized the word her. "And there must have been a dog along, the poor dog. You remember, I heard that from the hall. Figure that this Hilda, his wife, was left behind at the cottage." "Are you implying," broke in Mrs. Broderick incredulously, that beautiful little girl and this Larson were eloping?" "I considered that," admitted Tyr, "but she tried to reach his wife after the crash. She showed that she was banking on the wife. That dished any possible elopement. It was something else." "You mean something worse," said Mrs. Broderick with a cold shiver up her spine. "Not necessarily," said Tyr cheerfully. "They may have been going to the village for Eskimo pie." Getting back to the main road, they said nothing. But once there, with the Caroline place and its brooding possibilities behind them, they shook off the spell of the silence as, turning sharply to the right, they found a crossroad. "Have you ever seen Larson, Mrs. Broderick?" asked Tyr abruptly. "Yes, a big man, blond, rather stupid looking. He drove in to see Nick about the ducks one day before you came. Businesslike, rather slow and stolid. Romantic? The sort of man to drive without lights because there was a girl and a moon?" "Never," said Mrs. Broderick. A minute later, as they turned into the Richfield Road, a back road, bumpy, little used. "How Larson must have cursed that moon," said Tyr cryptically. A practical man, slow, stolid, with everything going his way, to be balked by a moon, a tree, a girl. "Then you believe her story? You believe there was a fallen tree?" asked Mrs. Broderick. Tyr whirled to look at her. "You heard her, saw her," he said. "You believed her, didn't you?" "Why, yes," said Mrs. Broderick, "but I'm a woman." "Well, I carried her upstairs," said Tyr. And then, quite suddenly, they saw the fallen tree, a big willow lying across the road, rotted at its heart and felled by a recent storm. But there was no sign of a wrecked car about. The road lay deserted, quiet, and all the songsters in the neighborhood were greeting the dawn. "Shall we go forward together, or would you rather wait here while I look things over?" said Tyr. Mrs. Broderick glanced toward the row of willows at the right, toward the high bushes at the left, and swallowed hard. The place, peaceful, filled with song as it was, repelled her. "Tyr, this place gives me the creeps," she said. "But I shall be able to sit here for 5 minutes, not more, without screaming." "You're nervous," said Tyr, "and no wonder. But you're a dead game sport, Mrs. Broderick. I've got to hand it to you." "Thanks," said Mrs. Broderick, sniffing suspiciously. "Just in case," said Tyr briefly, and laid upon the seat beside her a small, blunt-nosed object which came out of his dressing gown. Then, bareheaded, barefooted, except for his loose bath slippers, rumpled hair, and alert, he flapped up the road. But when he came back, he came slowly. He was carrying something in his arms. "The dog! The poor dog!" he said quietly. "Each little thing we come up with, Mrs. Broderick, sheds new light on Larson. By his works we shall know him. He left this poor chap to die. The poor chap in Tear's arms looked up at Mrs. Broderick dumbly. "He managed to crawl a bit when he saw me," said Tear slowly, smoothing the drooping head. "He licked my fingers." "Give him to me," said Mrs. Broderick. Very gently he was transferred to Mrs. Broderick's polo coat. Dumbly he settled down upon her lap, looked up into her face, licked her hand. Weakly he tried to wag his tail. Tear, over the side of the car, rubbed the sleek black head. "Small for a cocker, aren't ya?" he said. "I had a cocker when I was a kid. Pretty smart old works at understanding. Think we're pretty nice folks. Think you'll go along home with us." "So it happened as she said," said Mrs. Broderick. "Just," said Tear. "It must have been a fairly light car. He slammed on the brakes, it skidded and turned turtle. He and she weren't alone. It took more than one man to get that car on its way again. His first thought, even ahead of catching her, was to destroy the evidence. He's cautious, Larson, and long-headed. He figured he could reach her again later, so she managed to get clear. Trying to make it to Hilda, shuddering over the little dog, but not daring to stop, said Mrs. Broderick somberly. "Let's go home," she added suddenly. Tear drove silently. Mrs. Broderick, her smooth face a little drawn, gently stroked the dog's head. Once, when a sudden jolt made the little beast whimper, "I shall report Larson to the police at once," she said. "For what?" asked Tear mildly. "For fast driving? For breaking a dog's leg? We've got nothing on Larson, Mrs. Broderick." "She has," said Mrs. Broderick. "But she won't talk to the police, Mrs. Broderick, if she wouldn't talk to us. She's shielding someone." "Larson?" "Heavens, I hope not," said Tear quickly. "Perhaps when she's more calm and rested she will talk to us," suggested Mrs. Broderick hopefully. "Perhaps," admitted Tear, "but I doubt it." It was only when she saw her own gate posts that Mrs. Broderick relaxed. Then she sat up straight again and touched Tear's arm. "Nick," she breathed into Tear's ear, "just ahead at the gate." Now it could not be considered strange that Nick should be abroad in the early morning, provided he was upon his job. But here lay the strangeness. Nick was not always upon the job. Mrs. Broderick more than once suspected him of soldiering. His results were fairly satisfactory, but she sniffed at his methods. She divined hocus pocus with the ducks. Continued on page 204. We'll take a little break here, look at the picture above, and then look at one ad. This says, "Was anyone killed?" "I don't know," shuddered the girl. "I was thrown clear." Let's just have a look. Okay. Here is the ad of the marvelous Victor Company original talking machine. And they call each of these musicians a Victor artist. Really going for the branding, eh? So here we go. Because of the merit of his interpretations and the beauty of his voice, Warenrath ranks among the great artists of today. And he is a Victor artist because his Victor records exactly parallel his public performances. Among his 26 Victor Red Seal records are Dreaming Alone in the Twilight, Love Sends a Little Gift of Roses, Story of the Rose, Tell Me Daisy, Danny Deever, On the Road to Mandalay. And this is one of the styles. This is the Victrola number 260, $150. Wow, nice wood, mahogany or walnut. Then we have 𝒊𝒒𝒎𝒆, Victor artist. With a voice like hers, it was inevitable that 𝒊𝒒𝒎𝒆 would be heard on Victor records. She has learned from experience that only the Victor can bring to you her interpretations exactly as she recorded them, and this is fully borne out by her first Victor record. So she has her first one. This Victrola is 110, mahogany, oak, or walnut. And this one is electric. This one here is even more. It's 250. Electric is 290, and it is made in walnut. This is High Fetz, and he's numbered with the really great among violinists.
Every one of his 40 records is a perfect transcription of his art, and for that reason, Heifetz is a Victor artist. And these are some of his recordings or records. Now what I found interesting is down here we have this RCA dog. I believe his name is Nipper. And I will add a copy of the picture more up to date. And look, the dog is listening to his master's voice. You see, it comes out so clearly like his own master's voice that the dog is truly curious. The Victor Company originated the modern talking machine and was the first to offer the public high-class music by great artists. Victor's supremacy began then. It has been maintained by the continuing patronage of the world's greatest musician and by the merit of Victor products. In buying a talking machine, consider that you must choose the Victrola or something you hope will do as well. And remember that the Victrola, the standard by which all are judged, costs no more. The Victrola instrument line includes 21 models of the 3 general types shown at from $25 and up. Well, the ones we looked at were more than that. Victrola. Look under the lid and on the labels for these Victor trademarks. Victor Talking Machine Company.
Let's continue from page 5. "We'll stop. I'll speak to him," she said. And when they drew up near him, she beckoned. She had to beckon, for the man kept at his little distance, staring with a stare which he could neither abate nor control at the dog, while she checked him up on the work for the day, the raspberries to be brought in for preserving, the vegetables for dinner, the lettuce for luncheon salad, the birdhouse to go up in the maple grove. He answered mechanically, staring. "He knows the dog," said Mrs. Broderick as they left the gate and came up the driveway. "He was in it. He was there." But even Nick's effect went down before Miss Floyd's, for at the door between the big jars of blue hydrangea stood Miss Floyd, also waiting. When she saw them, she hurried forward. "Is she safe?" called Miss Floyd at the sight of them. "Have you found her?" "Found whom?" asked Mrs. Broderick, who was invariably grammatical. "Safe who?" asked Tear, who was not. "The girl," said Miss Floyd, actually wringing her hands. "The girl who came in the night." "But isn't she here?" cried Mrs. Broderick and Tear together. Her room is empty," said Miss Floyd, "and she is nowhere about. She has vanished. I believe she has been spirited away, but willing or unwilling, she's gone." Part 2. Some days later, Mrs. Broderick, recovering from a twisted knee and many bruises in her Big 4 poster, recounted to George, was able to divide the affair into 4 definite periods. The girl who came in the night, the 3 telephone calls, Hilda and... But Mrs. Broderick's last period must wait its turn. "It was a blow to find her gone," explained Mrs. Broderick to George, "and it gave me the most peculiar slipping sensation in my feet, as if smooth ice was sliding away beneath them. And you were away. Every crisis in our lives, George, has found you in Kansas City or the bathtub." "Businesslike, clean," admitted Mr. Broderick. "That's me." I sank down upon a chair in the telephone room after we had settled the poor dog and sent for a vet, continued his wife. "And as I sat there, my elbow on the table, in my very ear, George, sounded a woman's voice, urgent, imperative, hushed, insistent. 'Keep her with you. Keep her. Keep her. For the love of heaven.' And then a sort of gurgling, choking sound that was horrible, and then a click, and then silence." In short, some days after the event, Mrs. Broderick was able to check up the affair and fill in the details. But at the actual moment of the first telephone call, she did nothing but sit with the silent receiver in her hand, staring up at Tear. "Keep her with you. Keep her for the love of heaven," repeated Mrs. Broderick in a whisper. even as she grasped the importance of the message, Tyr was at the telephone, banging away frantically, trying to get across to a withdrawn, mechanical, metallic-voiced central his urgent need of the number which had called. There was silence in the little telephone room when Tyr finally hung up the receiver. The woman, white-faced, anxious, looked up to Tyr, waiting for his comment. "Whether they traced the call or not," said Tyr at length, "that was Hilda on the phone, warning us of danger to her. And that was Larson choking Hilda off." Mrs. Broderick shuddered. "But how could they know that she had come to us?" she asked. "There are other houses." "Nick," said Tyr. The silence fell again like a pall. Tyr, pacing back and forth, stopped before Mrs. Broderick. "This is bad business, Mrs. Broderick," said he in his straightforward, clean-cut fashion. "And it's a dangerous business for you. Frankly, I think that if Mr. Broderick was at home, he'd chuck the whole thing at this stage and give me the air." "Tyr," said Mrs. Broderick suddenly, surprisingly, "have you any family, any home, any background?" "A married sister," answered Tyr. "No particular home at present, no particular background but the war." "Just where did Mr. Broderick pick you up?" "I applied at his office for the job." "Just why?" Tyr smiled. "One must eat," he conceded. "I see," said Mrs. Broderick slowly, thoughtfully. Then she shot off another tangent. "Tyr, have you ever met this girl who came in the night?" "No, Mrs. Broderick." "Do you know old Mr. Shelby Carolan or young Mrs. Joe?" "I do not, Mrs. Broderick." "You're after Larson. Do you know Larson? Have you ever had dealings with him?" "Never, Mrs. Broderick." "Suppose that I agree to withdraw, to drop out of this dangerous game you warn me against, and suppose I demand that you drop out also, or leave us?" Tyr spread out his hands and shrugged expressively. "I should be sorry," he said. Mrs. Broderick rose. "Then you refuse to withdraw? It's more important to you than food?" "I can't withdraw, Mrs. Broderick," said Tyr. He hesitated. "I'm willing to admit that I've got to block Larson," he added doggedly. "You had heard of Larson before last night?" "Yes, Mrs. Broderick." "And you had been up to the Carolan place before we went together?" Once or twice, yes." "What for?" "Just nosing about," said Tyr, "scouting." "Tyr, are you a detective?" asked Mrs. Broderick crisply. "I am not," said Tyr. There was a pause, and just then the telephone bell rang. Tyr stood still in his place, eyes on Mrs. Broderick, waiting for her definite decision. When she nodded to him and sank down in her chair again, he squared his shoulders imperceptibly as he came forward. "Mrs. George Broderick's residence?" asked a slow voice over the wire. "This is O.M. Larson speaking, superintendent at the Carolan place." "Yes, Mr. Larson," said Tyr. "I wish to thank you," continued the slow, guttural voice carefully, "that you were so kind to my wife's niece as to take her in last night." "Oh, that's all right, Mr. Larson, but you shouldn't let her walk so far again." "So far from where?" asked Larson. "To the village." "And from the village," said Tyr carefully, "where she has gone, you know, to get Eskimo pie." To get? To get? I do not understand," said Larson. "She told you?" "Well," cut in Tyr cheerfully, "she admitted that she wasn't good at judging distances." "She is not good at judging anything," said Larson. "You have been so kind. I wish to explain. My wife and we have great trouble with her niece. She had a craze in the head. Last night, my wife and I tried to take her over to Richfield, to the sanatorium, for treatment. She needs quiet to the nerves, and on the way she jumps out of the car and runs off. Is it to Mr. Broderick I am speaking?" "To Tyr, Mr. Broderick's man." "Ah, yes," said the slow voice. "The new young fella. You know Nick, Mr. Tyr. I buy some ducks off Nick." Today I drive over to get them, and I will bring my wife's niece home with me again. Not today, Larson, said Tyr easily. I do not understand, said the slow voice. You cannot take the young lady home today, Lord Larson. And why not? Because Mrs. Broderick has decided to keep her here, shall we say, until she is rested. You are kidding me, Tyr? You are some funny young fella, yes? Said Larson. Something for your ear over this matter. I do not stand for jokes. I come for my niece. If I do not get her, I go to the police. Tut, tut, Larson. You'll do nothing so foolish. Keeping a girl until she is rested is merely kind. You can't ring in police on that. Today I get my niece, said Larson violently, or I bring the cops. Why get excited over such a small matter? Asked Tyr. Lay off that police talk, Larson. You're giving yourself away. Once and for all, do you give me back the girl? Shouted Larson. Once we do not, said Tyr with deadly precision. Twice we do not. 3 times we do not. And just a moment before you hang up, something in your ear. There is no death, Larson. There is no death. Tyr paused, waiting, but no sound came, not even the click of the receiver. Larson was still at the other end, listening for more, and Tyr again, with deadly precision, gave him more. In this affair, there is to be no death, Mr. Larson, said Tyr. Clearly, coolly, almost cheerfully. Not even to your wife's little dog. And it was Tyr himself who cut off at this point by hanging up the receiver. May I speak to you, Mrs. Broderick? Said a voice from the doorway. Oh, Anna, come in, said Mrs. Broderick wearily. Anna, Irish, pretty, spotless in pink print, and small white apron, stepped into the telephone room. The young lady who came in the night, said Anna, left this on the writing table in her room. Thank you, Anna, said Mrs. Broderick, accepting the small envelope. You may run me a bath, and I shall be ready for my tray in about 15 minutes. Yes, Mrs. Broderick, said Anna. She was turning away when Tyr stopped her. Just a minute, Anna, said Tyr. I want you to find Nick and send him up to us here. Yes, Mr. Tyr, said Anna. And, Anna, we may need your help, added Tyr. How many people know that the young lady has gone? Anna pondered it. The 4 of us here, she said at length. The mistress, Miss Floyd, yourself, Mr. Tyr, and me. It is well that for a few hours no one should know. Anna, it's a case of life or death. Save us, murmured Anna, startled. Thank you, Anna, said Tyr. I knew we could count on you. Get Nick up here as soon as you can. Read this, said Mrs. Broderick to Tyr when the girl had gone. Spread out flat on the telephone table, the little letter produced an effect out of all proportion to its size. It read, You and your so beautiful house have been more than amiable to me. I do not wish to go, but the choice is not mine. I cannot tell you why I go or where. I cannot hope to see any of you for perhaps a long time, or for perhaps never. But I am alone and afraid a little, and it comforts me that in this same world with me you and the other lady and the tall young man, and that you should have been my friends. This night has shown me a home and a haven such as I have never known, with tears to leave you, with thanks, with love, Caro. Caro, mused Mrs. Broderick softly. So that's her name. She thinks in French, this niece of Hilda's. With tears she leaves us, with love. There's an enclosure. Open it, Tyr. With fingers that fumbled a little, Tyr opened the folded inner paper and spread it flat. Mrs. Broderick stared down at it, Miss Floyd leaning over her shoulder to look. For a time the 3 studied the thing in silence. It's a section of a building, said Mrs. Broderick. It's the east elevation of the Carolyn place, said Tyr rapidly, exultantly, with a cross marking in the room where we saw the light. Remember the big urns along the stone balustrade. There they are. Remember the chimney? There it is. And up 3 stories across for that window. She's left us a line, Mrs. Broderick, a clue. She drew it and left it deliberately. It's permission. Don't you see how this alters everything? The fact that she's willing to turn to us again, to let us in on it. Don't tell me, Mrs. Broderick said, that you're planning to get into that crossed window, Tyr? Into it or out of it, said Tyr happily. I say, Mrs. Broderick, could you manage to flag Nick when he shows up until I can get into some clothes? You're insane, Tyr, said Mrs. Broderick tartly. But Tyr, flapping out of his bath slippers, merely waved an expressive arm over his shoulder. Why, exclaimed Miss Floyd, staring after him in surprise. Did you see that gesture, my dear? That sociable gesture? And have you noticed his speech, his manner? I'm beginning to forget that young man is our butler. Mrs. Broderick, rising, laid a firm hand on Miss Floyd's shoulder. He isn't our butler, she hissed dramatically into Miss Floyd's ear. And he has never been anybody's butler before. George, my dear, has simply planted him here for a deep unknown purpose. I like the boy. Mrs. Broderick stopped suddenly, listened, and presently heavy footsteps in the hall materialized into a heavy figure in the doorway with a heavy face above it. Oh, Nick, said Mrs. Broderick, sit down on that chair by the door, and, humming a little tune, she took up the telephone book. For some time there was silence, except for Mrs. Broderick's little tune and the crisp sound of paper leaves turning. I gave orders that no ducks should be sold. How many did you sell to Larson, Nick? Asked Mrs. Broderick suddenly. Nick, eyes swiftly lifted, swiftly lowered, twirled his imaginary cap. I ain't sold ducks to nobody, he said, on the defensive. Any guy that says I sold him ducks, he added savagely, the guy lies. Larson said so over the telephone not 10 minutes ago, said Mrs. Broderick. I heard him. Does he lie? Nick half rose and then sank back again. He was flushed, uneasy, bewildered. If Larson said that he's a blasted liar, said Nick with a show of bluster. Ah, said Mrs. Broderick mildly, flicking over the leaves. I'm going to let you tell him so now. What was the number of Larson's cottage phone, Miss Floyd? 40 something, said Miss Floyd, limping across to the table, bending to look, running a forefinger down the page. Here it is, Chester 403. Mrs. Broderick unhooked the receiver and waited. Chester 403, she said sweetly when Central answered, and as she waited, she hummed her little tune. Say, said Nick suddenly, hoarsely, rising from his chair. Don't call that number. There's nobody in Larson's cottage. It's shut up, empty. It's no good to call that number, I tell you. Of course you'd tell me, said Mrs. Broderick coolly, contemptuously. Nobody wants to be caught red-handed. I've suspected you of thieving for a long time, Nick. I've had no proof, but this time I've got you. You ain't got me, cried Nick desperately. You can go out and count 'em. The ones that are missing is dead. A lot of eggs got smashed moving them, and there's been a fox round nights. Chester 403, repeated Mrs. Broderick sweetly. Say, said Nick, advancing toward the telephone table. Don't call that number. The cottage is shut, I tell you. Yes, sighed the exhausted, slow little voice over the wire. Chester 403. Larson's cottage, shrilled Mrs. Broderick in surprise. Yes, the cottage, came the answer, slowly, exhaustedly. Is this Hilda speaking? No, not Hilda, came the dreamlike, tranced voice, haltingly, gaspingly. Poor Hilda cannot. Poor Hilda! Oh, my dear, so you are there, cried Mrs. Broderick excitably, uncontrollably. We have found you. We have your note. We understand. We are coming. Does Larson know you are there? Not yet. Are you alone there with Hilda? Has something happened to Hilda? You said poor. Has she been hurt? Oh, heavens, not killed. She hasn't been killed. But at this moment, the receiver was wrenched from Mrs. Broderick's hand. Mrs. Broderick was pushed violently forward. The receiver was hurled across the telephone room and fell with a smash. And Nick, whirling, lowered his heavy head between his shoulders like a bull and made for the doorway. But it was not Nick's morning. Young Tears, sprinting down the staircase, 3 at a time, arrived at the necessary valuable instinct before the bull-like rush, and Young Tear stuck out a foot neatly. The crash of Nick tripped, and going down sounded in Mrs. Broderick's ears as she struggled to her feet. Not so rough, buddy, she heard from Young Tear grimly as the rocking room settled itself once more. Or you might scratch up the floor. May I use that stash of yours, Miss Floyd, just to tie up his wrists? Heave over, boy. Did the big goof hurt ya, Mrs. Broderick, or did I land him in time? Mrs. Broderick, a permanently waved, slightly hysterical Venus, rose from the sea of mauve dressing gown. In the nick of time, Tear, she said shakily, triumphantly, foolishly. In the nick. Heh, heh. End of part 2. This can't apply to me. Here's a beautiful woman, but she looks trepidatious. Why would that be? Let's zero in. A rather unusual advertisement had caught her eye and set her wondering. It talked about something she had never heard discussed among the people she knew, not even the most intimate of her girl acquaintances. But it set her thinking. Maybe this was the thing that was holding her back with the men she wanted most to attract, a thing that had never before entered her mind. That's the insidious thing about halitosis. Unpleasant breath. You yourself rarely know when you have it. And even your closest friends won't tell you. Sometimes, of course, halitosis comes from some deep-seated organic disorder that requires professional advice, but usually, unfortunately, halitosis is only a local condition that yields to the regular use of Listerine as a mouthwash and gargle. It is an interesting thing that this well-known antiseptic that has been in use for years for surgical dressings possesses these unusual properties as a breath deodorant. It halts food fermentation in the mouth and leaves the breath sweet, fresh, and clean, not by substituting some other odor, but by really removing the old one. The Listerine odor itself quickly disappears. So the systematic use of Listerine puts you on the safe and polite side. Your druggist will supply you with Listerine. He sells lots of it. It has dozens of different uses as a safe antiseptic and has been trusted as such for half a century. Read the interesting little booklet that comes with every bottle. Oh, okay. So that solves her problem. Mr. Broderick, building his long, low line of poultry houses beside the brook at the foot of the garden, had put in a narrow enclosed staircase to a loft above one of the duck houses, and had covered the occasional windows with iron bars. And there it seemed only logical that Nick should be locked up. From the rear terrace, Mrs. Broderick watched Tear and the Swedish chauffeur run Nick down the hill by the collar, and in imagination followed them up the narrow staircase to Nick's inevitable conclusion for the morning. Turning to cook and Anna and Kitty and the laundress and the kitchen maid grouped behind her, Mrs. Broderick spoke. Nick has been selling ducks on the side against orders, she said briefly. Send Tear up to me, Anna, as soon as he comes back to the house. And, Maggie, clear coffee extra strong for my tray. Yes, Mrs. Broderick. But when Anna came up with the tray, she brought news as well. I couldn't give Mr. Tear your message, ma'am, because he never came back to the house at all after putting Nick away in the clink, said Anna. But the roadster's gone out the gates, ma'am, with Mr. Tear in it, alone. Mrs. Broderick sat silently erect in her basket chair, drinking her coffee. Then she rose to her feet and glanced at her wristwatch. After a tub, a shower, and breakfast, she ordered the station wagon. Bowling along the sunlit road behind Martin in the station wagon, Mrs. Broderick reassured herself that she must have misunderstood the girl's meaning over the telephone, for the girl had not actually said anything definitely terrible. "Merely a sprained ankle," said Mrs. Broderick aloud, "or at the worst a broken leg. A beautiful morning for a broken leg, Martin," she continued pleasantly. "Yes, ma'am," agreed Martin, mystified. "There's a car in trouble ahead, ma'am. Shall I stop?" "Well, we might just ask if they need anything," conceded Mrs. Broderick. Working over the mulberry-colored foreign low-hung car was a smart mulberry-liveried chauffeur. Walking up and down on impatient, patent leather-sandaled small feet in the thinnest of gray silk stockings was a lady, a nervous, excited, eager, fashionable lady. "Because I tell him twice to step on it, the fool overheats the engine," exclaimed the lady to Mrs. Broderick, spreading out her hands. "And I'm in the deuce of a hurry, my dear. Are you going to be really sweet and take me along?" "We aren't going very far ourselves," said Mrs. Broderick, "only to the Caroline place up the road to see Larson, the superintendent, about some ducks." "What luck!" said the lady. "I happen to be going there myself. Hilda, Larson's wife, is a friend of mine." Mrs. Broderick eyed her askance as she got in and saw that her hands were shaking. "Such a nuisance life, isn't it?" said the lady. "The only way is to take it in high and never to look back. There's no occasion for secrecy," she added. "I'm Mrs. Joe Caroline." "Yes, I know that," said Mrs. Broderick. "I saw you once at the 𝑵𝒊𝒈𝒉𝒕s." "Stupid people, the 𝑵𝒊𝒈𝒉𝒕s," said Mrs. Joe coolly. "Fast driver, your man," she said with a shiver. "We might be jogging along to a funeral." "We're just there, I think," said Mrs. Broderick mildly. "This is the beginning of the wall." Once inside, there was no trace of Tyr anywhere about, nor of the racing roadster. "The turn to the left for the cottage, Martin," said Mrs. Broderick. At the cottage, closed, shuttered, silent, as it had been in the early morning, the two women got out together, walked together up the gravelled path, rang the bell, and waited on the doorstep. After repeated ringings, nothing answered. "I have reason to believe," Mrs. Broderick said, "that this Hilda Larson is incapacitated. Suppose we try the rear door?" "Suppose we don't," said the other woman abruptly. "Suppose you go home now, my dear," she added rapidly, "and let me deliver to Larson any message you like." Mrs. Broderick looked at her pleasantly and shook her head. Then suddenly the other woman was down the steps and flying around the house. And very quickly for a large woman, Mrs. Broderick was down the steps and after her. She caught her up in her little enclosed rear porch, managing to get her firm foot in its rubber-soled shoe sufficiently within the crack of the door to prevent its closing. For the door stood open, and Mrs. Joe, darting in, had tried to close it upon Mrs. Broderick. "No, you don't," said Mrs. Broderick. "Oh, very well," said the other. "Come in if you like. There's nothing to hide." They were standing in the kitchen. "Nobody's here," said Mrs. Joe as Mrs. Broderick opened a door. "Someone answered the telephone here this morning," said Mrs. Broderick stubbornly. Mrs. Joe shrugged listlessly and followed her. Together they looked through the first floor. Going over to Mrs. Joe, Mrs. Broderick looked at her steadily. "Are you trying to block me idly, or have you a purpose? Are you actually in with this Larson?" Mrs. Joe slumped against the newel post and stared at her curiously. "Don't you see that he's evil and scrupulous and that he's after money somehow, somewhere, at any cost? Don't you want to rescue that beautiful little girl?" "What beautiful little girl?" came at last haltingly. "The name she signed to the note was Caro," said Mrs. Broderick gently, "and she had a hand ready to help the other woman if she should fall." But she did not fall. She just stared at Mrs. Broderick dumbly. "She's safe in Paris," she managed at last. "She's here," said Mrs. Broderick softly, triumphantly. "Now, will you stand aside?" But Mrs. Joe had covered her face with both hands. "I didn't know," she moaned. "Give me a minute to get used to it. Of course, now I'm with you." Together they mounted the steep staircase, but she was trembling all over when they reached the top. She pointed to a closed door. "There, Hilda's room, the phone," she whispered. Mrs. Broderick opened the door. She was a woman of extraordinarily steady nerves. She did not scream, nor cry out, nor do anything except stand motionless, as if turned to stone, looking in. The room was shuttered, dimly lighted as the rest had been, but it was not in order as the rest had been. It looked as if its order, its attempt at beauty, its pride in its humble achievement had been torn to pieces deliberately, had been stamped upon savagely, and been ripped apart by some gigantic force. There had been a struggle. There had been horror, fear, violence. These had passed. The room was still now, with an utter stillness that reached out and laid its dead weight upon the two in the doorway. Beside the little bedside table which held the telephone, Hilda lay as she had been flung down for the last time. There was a dark, spreading stain on the breast of her gingham dress, and her poor hands, palms turned up peacefully now, had been cut. She had fought for her life, poor Hilda, strongly, desperately. But the odds had been against her. The gigantic force had been too much for her. Lying there in her blood-splattered, ambitious little room, she almost smiled up at the trembling women. "Love, courage, faith," she seemed to say. "These are the great things. These make living worthwhile. Love, courage, faith. I do not lose them by dying." 4. For the fourth time that morning, Larson was washing his hands. The knocking on the inner wall was going on as usual, regularly, monotonously. 3 short taps and an interval. 3 taps and an interval. 3 taps. "Hey!" yelled Larson. "Cut it out, or I'll come in there and I'll tie you up." The stains were all gone now. They must be gone. Anxiously, he examined his big wrists, his muscular forearms. Carefully, he turned down the sleeves of his striped shirt and looked at the cuffs. Then, going over to a small mirror hung between 2 windows of the improvised upstairs kitchen, he jerked up the shade and looked at his collar. There was a stain on the collar. Ripping it off, he stood with it in his hand. 3 taps, interval. 3 taps. "Hey!" Larson heard himself shouting. "Drop it, you fool! Nobody can hear you, nobody but me, and I laugh at you. Do you hear me? I laugh." Larson, marveling, heard himself laughing, and going over to the sink, he tried to wash his collar. A clear field, everything in his own hands, money in hand, more money than he had ever seen, money in sight, more money than he had ever imagined, and then Hilda had sprung the girl on him. Washing his collar, Larson saw them again so plainly, too plainly. Hilda and the girl stealing up what had been the servants' staircase when the huge house had been in use. The girl dressed out, fit for a ball, tricked out by Hilda to make her more beautiful. He could see her feet going up in their gleaming slippers, and besides them, Hilda's worn brown shoes, Hilda's blue-striped gingham. He brushed his hand across his eyes and dropped the collar on the floor. 3 taps, an interval. 3 taps. That had been last night. Only last night they had been creeping up that rear staircase when he caught them. Hilda had taken the long chance of his driving the doc back to the sanitarium. 3 taps, an interval. 3 taps. Going over to the window, Larson looked down upon the neglected garden, the grass-grown tennis court, and then across to the Carolyn woods. Well, until the last month, he had kept up the place. He had kept on the gardeners, the outside men, until the last month. One of their worst quarrels had come about when Hilda found that Tony had been dismissed. A good woman, Hilda, honest, faithful, clean. You had to hand it to her, loving too in her way. She used to make apple cake for him every Saturday, and never a hole in his socks or a button off his shirts. She must have written long before to the kid to come, written to Paris, or maybe she'd even cabled when she realized that things were coming to a head. And then she had tried to smuggle the kid in, and he had caught them. Going back to the sink, Larson began to wash his hands, but instead of his hands, he saw the two sunk down on the staircase together, cowering before him, the kid in Hilda's arms. He saw again Hilda's white face of defiance. "Over my dead body, Larson, over my dead body." And then there was a blur. Brushing his wet hands across his eyes did not dispel it, for the blur was in his brain. The next thing he could remember was the kid in some dark dress of Hilda's and a dog following the car. Jack, of course, Hilda's dog. And he had cursed the dog and had stopped the car and had ordered Nick to fetch it in. Nick somehow must have been in the car too. And Nick had fetched the dog in, and the kid had taken it in her arms. Larson, carefully drying his hands on Hilda's clean roller towel, fixed the time of that at about 11 or maybe half past, with the moon shining, something fierce, and the car doing 40 on the stretches. And then the fallen tree across the clear road, and the crash, and no kid anywhere to be found when they came to look for her. He walked to the door after drying his hands and glanced down the passage. It seemed to him that he had heard some sound below in the empty, echoing, locked house. Maybe the kid had screamed, but that was all right. She was shut in tight enough. For all he cared, she might stay shut in forever, mulling his game, his and the doc's, for Nick was only paid for what service he rendered. Nick wasn't to share in. Now, let's see. Let's try to fix the time. Early this morning, Nick had phoned that the kid had turned up at their place and had been taken in, and it must have been about then that he had missed Hilda. He had searched the house for her and even gone down into that room to look for her. Lately, he had managed to avoid that room and let Hilda run things in there, even to giving the doc's medicine, before he knew that he was a traitor, that she was trying to do him in. Maybe she hadn't given the doc's medicine at all. Blast that woman, Hilda. Away again now. Down at the cottage, probably, as she had been before, telephoning from the cottage so that he shouldn't hear. Doing him in. 3 taps on the party wall. 3 taps. That's right. Keep it up. Enjoy yourself, shouted Larson derisively. I'm going off now to find my wife, and when I get back, you'll knock. No more. Staggering, lurching, talking to himself, Larson clattered down the rear staircase next to the impoverished upstairs kitchen. A girl shuddering in a room below heard him coming, heard him pass, and drew a breath of relief to hear him go. At that moment, a telephone central in Richfield plugged in a hurried call to the police headquarters, and Tyr, having lain low to calculate his distance, rose from his crouched position on the north terrace, and with Mr. Broderick's stoutest, knobbiest walking stick in hand and 10 feet for a running start, leaped high enough to hook the curved handle of the stout walking stick into a low iron grill which fenced the window above him. Not enough purchase for a squirrel on the whole blamed facade, ran through Tyr's mind like a scarlet thread of memory as he swung precariously into space and, hand over hand, knob above knob, pulled himself up toward the window. With one arm over the iron grill and his feet digging for a foothold, he glanced down for the moment, at the moment that Larson, lurching around the corner of the house, glanced up and saw him. For the space of a breath of the tick of the clock, the scene held like a still, projected suddenly into a moving picture. Tyr hanging by one arm looking down, Larson motionless below him looking up. Then Tyr, with a heave and a scramble, was over the edge of the iron grill, his back to the heavy plate glass, and Larson, giving expression to his distaste, was beginning to shoot, for he had a gun as well as a knife, and had Larson. The blur in his brain momentarily was gone. He saw clearly again. He knew things as they were. He remembered perfectly now where Hilda was, how he had left her, and above him a mystery, a menace to his success, liberty, life, was an utterly strange young man walking up the side of the Caroline Palace like a fly. So Larson began to shoot. In haste, it is true, but quite sanely enough to be unpleasant, thought Tyr. In Richfield, a stocky little detective and 2 village policemen climbed into a department car, and Tyr, unhooking Mr. Broderick's walking stick, smashed the heavy window behind him, just as one of Larson's bullets plowed a slanting course across his sleek young head. It had been Tyr's intention to step, without too much concession, to haste through the broken window into the room behind it. Falling in, he was just able to stagger across the short distance he had still to go in order to drop at her feet. "Lock him out!" he gasped as he dropped, and before the blackness clamped utterly down, he managed to get a fold of dark dress into one hand, to drop his cheek upon one of the grass-stained, ruined, beautiful little slippers. "Darling!" added Tyr happily as he fainted. Opening his eyes after an interval, Tyr became aware of a wet bandage above them, of a face bending down, of hands clasped close above his own, and though his head felt like an exploding balloon, he was in reality quite unaware of it. So completely was he under the spell of the bending, wistful face and the gray eyes and clinging hands. "I've got a snapshot of you at home," he said happily, inconsistently, "taken on the terrace of the 𝑑. You had a tam on your lovely little head, and there was a dog." "But," said the girl, startled, "but," and she hesitated, "that was years ago, at the 𝑑. Dad took it." "Yes," Tyr said, "he gave it to me." The clinging hands tightened upon his own. The face bent nearer. "You knew Dad?" she faltered. "So well that he gave you?" "So well that I'm here," said Tyr quietly. "I was with him when he died, with you, your safety, your future, uppermost in his thought, alone in his heart. He distrusted Larson even then, and others, and yet the situation was so peculiarly a personal one, so intimate that he couldn't go with it even to the lawyers of his estate. He had no proof of anything wrong. It was a feeling, a fear, a suspicion, a possibility. And you can't take feelings to lawyers, or possibilities. We had been through the Marne together, and he knew my people here at home. He got rather to depend on me, as an older man will. So, what with one thing and another, at the end he put it up to me, and I promised." There fell a little silence. "You promised what?" breathed the girl. "Oh, it was easy. I wanted to," said Tyr. "What?" "Well, just to do my best to look out for you, to guard you, if you should ever come here to possible danger, and to keep it away from the cops and the papers. You were safe with Madame de Vries in Paris, but he couldn't die until the off chance was taken care of. The off chance was to be mine. But how terribly much to ask for you to give time, thought, devotion to a stranger." "Ah, but you weren't a stranger," said Tyr. "That's the whole point, you see, that you weren't. He had a miniature of you in the leather case. We used to look at it sometimes together. It was very little for him to ask. I jumped at it," said Tyr. "But you might have been away traveling. Alaska, California." "One can always travel back," said Tyr. "But you might have been wanting to be married. You might have been off on your honeymoon." "No," said Tyr very definitively. There was a pause, which he did not break, preferring to let her penetrate this definiteness slowly. That she reached the depth of it at length he knew when she stirred and drew back a little. "You knew that I was coming," she said. Why, I hardly knew it myself until Hilda cabled. She was still startled, a little breathless, but game. I just caught up old Marie and a bag or so, and I flew. I left Marie at the hotel in New York and came on here alone. But how could you have known? 𝑑e murmured Tyr. It was arranged that he should keep me informed of you, which he did regularly. Louis? You know dear old Louis? Tyr nodded, superbly unaware of his throbbing head. Louis and I ate beans out of the same can, said he. Why, then, her face was alight. You must be, but you can't be. I am, said Tyr. Mickey! You aren't. You can't be Mickey, Coniston, Michael Churchill Coniston, Louis, wild, sudden young American. Sure, who else? Said Tyr placidly. But you've left out a couple. They struck in a tear after the Churchill to cinch the Tyr money. He was feeling deliciously happy, lazy, sleepy, lying there on the floor. He had forgotten Larson. He had forgotten what might be waiting in the room above. She was safe. She was near. He had seen her eyes falter before his own. She was unutterably sweet. Always he had known that she would be like that. He had held off, had kept away, had been patient, but his patience and his restraint alike were slipping away from him now. In his effort to clutch at and retain them, Tyr came back to full consciousness with a bound and sat up straight. Larson, he said, I have forgotten Larson. You see, I happen to be terribly in love with you. I happen to have been in love with you from the beginning. But you were only a kid. I had to wait, and I couldn't gamble that you'd ever like me. But you do a little, darling, and feeling that you did a little, put everything else out of my head. I even forgot Larson. For a moment they looked at each other in silence. And I forgot Hilda, she confessed at length bravely. I forgot Hilda, whom every moment of my life I should remember. Hilda, he repeated mechanically. Why should you remember her? Because she is dead, said the girl somberly, bravely. Because of me. She sent for me. She tried to protect me last night, and she tried to warn me this morning, and he killed her for it. Hilda dead, he repeated incredulously. Larson has killed her? At the cottage. I was too late. Dropping her head against him, she sobbed quietly without tears. There on the gold-polished floor of the huge, shrouded, gorgeous Florentine room, they sat like two children, hushed, murmuring, awed, stricken, comforting one another. Full realization came first to the man. So Larson's a killer, said he. Actual, not potential. This alters things. He may kill others. I must get upstairs quickly. Did he drag you up here from the cottage and lock you in? He brought me up. He didn't touch me. He seemed tranced somehow. He locked the double doors into the hall. He forgot the other door. Which? Said Tyr. There, said the girl and pointed shakily. Don't leave me behind. The other door led to a dressing room and beyond to a bath. From there, the way lay clear to the upper hallway again. Through the filtered light, through the silence, through beauty hushed and veiled, they crept forward still, hand in hand. They were rounding the turn of the upper staircase when they heard a monotonous voice shouting somewhere above. They listened a moment, standing together, one of his arms thrown about her, her face hidden against his shoulder. That isn't, she questioned him at length, piteously in a whisper. That can't be anyone belonging to me? No, he reassured her. That's Larson threatening, boasting. Heaven knows what. Gone the whole length of the road he's been traveling, gone insane. And he started on. Wait, she caught him by the arm. I hear a car below. Someone is coming. Go down to them. It may be Mrs. Broderick. Let her in. I'm going with you. Darling, are you beginning to love me a little? Go down to Mrs. Broderick. Open the rear door Larson used. Stay with Mrs. Broderick. Stooping quickly, Michael Churchill Tier Coniston kissed her upturned earnest eyes, and was gone about the turn of the upper staircase. For a moment or so she waited, listening to the sounds below. The noise of the car had ceased, but she heard knocking, voices, and the slam of a distant door. Perhaps it had stood open. Probably Larson had forgotten it, as he had forgotten the door of the cottage. Someone had come in below. Well, that didn't matter. Nothing mattered to her now but that upper room and what it held of her future, her life, her love. Slipping like a shadow about the turn in the staircase, she obeyed the imperious call. The shouting voice above had ceased. The sounds below had died away. Through silence, she slipped like a shadow along the upper hallway. She passed several closed doors. She glanced into a room like a kitchen where water dripped into a sink. Through the open window she glimpsed the Carolyn woods, stately and green and swaying in the sunshine. At the open door of the third room from the chimney she stopped. Long afterward, cruising under faraway tropic skies beneath the spell of a joy of life which she had never imagined, the look of that room as she glimpsed it then would sometimes flash back upon her. A large room, handsomely furnished as a bedroom, with dark shades drawn down against the sunlight, and an electric reading lamp glowing beside a big armchair close to the inner wall. She was aware of Larson, hands held above his head, standing near the armchair of Mickey Coniston, facing him across it, with a revolver in one hand and her bandage still bound about his forehead. But even beyond these, her eyes were drawn and held by the figure wrapped in velvet dressing gown, which sat stiffly upright in the armchair, by the unbowed gray head, by the cool, disdainful, distinguished, unmoved old face. "At least it hasn't bored me," the man in the armchair was saying in a cool, disdainful, unmoved old voice. "When I found that the fools actually held me prisoner in my own house, life began to hold an interest from day to day. It was amusing to see how far they might go, to calculate one's chances, to tip the scale of their greed up and down. Before that, I had been reduced for amusement to throwing money now and then to a debt-ridden daughter-in-law. But to watch a doctor dropping his lugubrious little poisons into my coffee cup, and then not to drink the coffee, or to see Larson's face when I had him open the safe, or when I made an occasional new will, leaving him everything and then did not sign it." The cool fingers flicked the ash of a cigar lightly away. "There have been moments, and Hilda was always an anchor to windward. A good woman, Hilda, honest as the day." Here the bright, scornful old eyes under the shaggy eyebrows flashed up at Larson, quickly, suspiciously. "I have called her repeatedly this morning in vain. I'm anxious about her. As to you, my young sir, although you are a stranger to me, your arrival is opportune. For I verily believe that in a moment or so more this ass here might have finished me." "He has killed his wife, Mr. Carolan," said Mickey Coniston quietly. "And I'm not a stranger to your son, or to your granddaughter." "To my son? To my granddaughter?" The old hands gripped the armchair tightly, convulsively. The voice quivered into life, into feeling. "My son is dead. My granddaughter has been kept from me because I hated her mother. Her love has been turned from me. I am alone, alone. I have sent for her, but she does not come. I have begged her, but she will not come." "She will come. She has come, Mr. Carolan," said Mickey Coniston quietly, eyeing Larson above his revolver. "She's behind you in the doorway now." Like a shadow, she slipped into the room and across it. In the circle of light from the reading lamp she stood. "Not come!" she said, stretching out both hands toward the figure more than ever stiffly upright now in the armchair. "When you showed a sign at last that you wanted me, that you still loved me." She hung poised above him for a moment, and then at something forlorn and hungry in the look of the fierce old eyes, she knelt and put her tender arms about him. "Poor, poor, poor," she murmured as his hand ventured to touch her cheek and her hair. "Never alone, never again, never alone again," she crooned as she might have done to a child. The rest happened quickly enough. "Steady, Larson," warned Mickey Coniston. "Steady." But Larson was beyond caution now, beyond hope. He missed Hilda. He must try to find Hilda before that gun went off. She might be in the hall or in the kitchen. Larson head down for a rush, blind, deaf, dumb, his blurred brain driven by two fears, which were, one, driven by the scourging thought that the gun with the drop on him might speak before he reached Hilda. He made a rush for the door and made a rush down the hall. There were people coming up the hall, two women, and behind them a man in a chauffeur's livery. One of these women caught at him strongly, courageously, as he swung past. Without effort, he twisted her off and threw her savagely away. She fell like a crumpled rag doll. In the kitchen now, but no Hilda, and behind him, running footsteps, behind him, the gun with the drop on him. At the open window, Larson stood for one instant looking across at the Carolyn woods, and at that instant she beckoned. "Hilda!" cried Larson joyously in answer. "Hilda!" and pitched head foremost from the open window. When Tyr, white and shaken, after a look from the window, reached the spot to which Mrs. Broderick had been flung, that lady, white and shaken, was feeling her knee with one hand and straightening her hat with the other. "I knew the girl from the first moment I saw her in the moonlight," said Mrs. Broderick, breathless but indomitable as usual. "The Carolyn princess? Why, every tourist in Paris looks for their house in the Bois, and I had her pointed out to me at the bootmaker's. I've brought her mother along with me, Tyr, and that explains why the girl didn't even tell us. She was afraid that her mother, poor Mrs. Joe, you remember that hard-boiled Mrs. Joe, might have been in it. But she wasn't, Tyr," ended Mrs. Broderick triumphantly, sitting on the floor of the upper hallway, still feeling her knee. "I am convinced of it. She needed money so badly. But murder? Never, Tyr." "I'm convinced of it too, Mrs. Broderick," said Mickey Coniston gently. "And now, Tyr, before you give me your arm into Mr. Carolyn," said Mrs. Broderick, "what is your name?" "Coniston," said Tyr, "but my friends call me Mickey." Mrs. Broderick, under the stress of the situation and her twisted knee, actually groaned. "Surely not the Coniston that got all that money," she gasped. "Why, then, Tyr, you must know my son-in-law, Amby Symes." "Sure," said Tyr, smiling a little. "Amby and I ate beans out of the same can, at Harvard," he added. Outside, on the stone-flagged south terrace, two village policemen and a stocky little detective measured with their eyes the distance up to an open window. "Murder and suicide," said the stocky little detective, checking off on 2 fingers. "Saves the country money and finishes off the case. Neat. That's what I call it. Neat." The end.